The road disappeared long before the map said it would. I remember the tires rolling over loose gravel, while fog pressed against the windshield like pale smoke. The ranch sat somewhere beyond the trees, hidden behind miles of dead silence and rusted fencing. No lights, no neighbors, just endless land stretching beneath a sky that looked bruised black. The radio kept losing signal every few minutes. Static, then humming, then silence again. I should have turned back when the animals started appearing along the roadside. Deer standing perfectly still in the dark. Cows facing the woods instead of the road. Not moving, not blinking, as if they were listening to something far away. When I finally reached the ranch, the front porch light was swinging slowly in the wind. No breeze, just movement. The owner had warned me over the phone not to wander outside after midnight. He sounded exhausted when he said it, like a man who hadn't slept in years. He told me strange lights crossed the fields every few nights. Sometimes the dogs vanished. Sometimes people woke up with dirt under their fingernails and cuts they couldn't explain. But the worst part wasn't the lights. It was the silence that came before them. That heavy silence that swallowed the insects, the wind, even your own breathing. And sometime after 2:13 a.m., while standing beside the old cattle barn, I finally understood why nobody stayed at that ranch for long. Because something in the sky was looking back. And that's when I saw it. The ranch sat miles beyond the last paved road, surrounded by dry grass, broken fences, and fields so empty they felt abandoned long before I arrived. It was late October when I became the caretaker of Black Hollow Ranch. The air carried dust and the cold smell of dead weeds. Every gate groaned in the wind. Every wooden post leaned slightly toward the earth. The owner barely stayed long enough to hand me the keys. He looked tired, not old, just tired in a way that settled behind the eyes. Before leaving, he paused beside his truck and quietly said, "Keep the horses inside after dark." Then he drove away into the fading light, leaving me alone with the silence stretching across the hills. The first night felt normal enough. The barn smelled of hay and damp wood. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, while cold air slipped through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the sky looked endless, cloudless, black. I remember standing near the cattle pens with my flashlight, hanging loosely at my side. That was when I noticed the lights, far beyond the ranch boundary, hovering over the hills, pale white shapes drifting slowly through the darkness. Not headlights, not lanterns. They moved without shaking, without noise, just floating there above the dry land. I watched them for almost a minute before they disappeared behind the ridge. The wind suddenly felt colder against my face. And somewhere behind me, one of the horses kicked violently against its stall door. After that, the animals refused to leave the barn at night. Every evening became the same. As sunset faded, the horses backed away from the open doors. Their breathing turned sharp and uneven, warm clouds of breath filling the cold air. Even the dogs stopped wandering after dark. They stayed beneath the porch, whining softly toward the distant hills. A few nights later, I began hearing the humming, low, steady, barely noticeable at first. It drifted through the ranch sometime after midnight, vibrating faintly through the wooden floorboards beneath my boots. The horses reacted immediately whenever it started. They trembled hard enough to rattle their stalls. Their eyes rolled white in the lantern light, foam gathering near their mouths. But the strangest part was the silence around the hum. No insects, no wind through the grass, just that low vibration pressing against the air. One morning, while checking the south fence line, I found burn marks across the dirt road, perfect circles, each one blackened deep into the ground as if the earth itself had blistered. There were 5 of them, stretching across the road in a straight line. The dirt inside the circles felt strange beneath my boots, warm, even in the freezing morning air. I crouched beside one and brushed my fingers against the soil. A faint metallic smell lingered there, sharp and bitter in the back of my throat. That night, the humming returned earlier than usual. The windows vibrated softly. Loose nails inside the walls gave tiny metallic clicks. I tried distracting myself with the old ranch records stacked near the fireplace. But sometime after 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. I checked my watch. 2:13 a.m. Then everything disappeared. Not darkness, not sleep, sound. The humming stopped instantly. The horses stopped moving. Even the wind outside vanished. The silence felt wrong. Heavy, like the entire ranch had been buried beneath snow. I stood slowly from the chair. My heart beat suddenly loud inside my ears. The house creaked once beneath my feet. Then nothing again. No breath. No insects. No distant coyotes. Just complete silence pressing against the windows. I moved toward the kitchen slowly. The cold floor chilled through my socks. Outside the window, the fields looked silver beneath the moonlight. Empty. Still. Then I saw it. A pale light floating above the pasture. Closer than before. It drifted silently over the fences, moving without hurry. The glow around it looked soft at the edges, almost fog-like. I couldn't tell how large it was, only that it seemed wrong against the sky. The light continued forward until it reached the ranch house. Then it stopped, directly above the roof. The walls began humming again, soft this time, gentle enough to feel through my teeth. I remember gripping the edge of the sink, while cold sweat gathered along my neck. Above me, something moved slowly across the ceiling. Not footsteps, just pressure, like enormous weight settling carefully over the house. The pale light outside brightened through the kitchen window, filling the room with a dull white glow. And somewhere deep inside the barn, one of the horses screamed. Fog rolled across the ranch almost every night after sunset, thin at first, then thick enough to swallow the fences and cattle pens whole. The water tower stood behind the north pasture, old rusted legs, bent metal, and a ladder that groaned whenever the wind touched it. I noticed the figure 3 nights after the lights appeared above the hills. At first, I thought it was one of the fence posts. Tall, still, half hidden by fog. But fence posts do not appear where there were none before. I stood on the porch with cold air pressing against my face. The smell of wet dirt drifted through the fields. Far away, coyotes cried once, then abruptly stopped. The figure remained beside the water tower, perfectly motionless. I could not make out details, only the shape, tall shoulders, long arms, a body too thin to look natural. I stared at it for several minutes. The fog moved, the grass bent softly, but the silhouette never shifted. The next morning, I walked out toward the tower. Dry weeds cracked beneath my boots. The air smelled metallic again, like burned wires after rain. Around the base of the tower, footprints circled through the dirt, long narrow prints, too deep to belong to a child, too thin to belong to a man. They looped around the tower again and again, then suddenly stopped. No return tracks, no drag marks, nothing, just empty dirt where the final footprint ended. That night, the fog returned heavier than before. The ranch lights barely reached beyond the porch. Everything outside looked drowned in pale gray. I told myself I would not look toward the tower. But sometime after midnight, I stepped outside anyway. The cold bit through my jacket immediately. The horses inside the barn stomped nervously. Their warm breath drifted through the cracks in the walls. And there was again the figure, standing beside the tower. Closer this time. I could feel it somehow, even through the fog. The low humming returned shortly after. Soft vibrations moved through the porch board beneath my feet. The dogs whimpered under the house. Then came the tapping. Metallic, slow. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The noise came from beside my bedroom window. Not loud, not aggressive, almost careful. I stood in the hallway listening. The old wallpaper shifted slightly in the cold air. Pipes inside the walls gave tiny clicks. Then again, tap, tap. My mouth felt dry. I moved toward the window slowly. Each floorboard creaked beneath my weight. The tapping stopped before I reached the glass. Outside, the fog drifted silently through the yard. The porch light barely reached the fence line. No one was there, but near the water tower, I saw the silhouette again, still watching the house. Over the next few nights, the figure continued moving closer. Not while I watched. never directly. Each evening it simply appeared nearer than before, first beside the tower, then near the cattle pens, then beside the broken fence near the porch. Always motionless, always silent. The fog seemed to follow it. Even the air changed whenever it appeared. The temperature dropped sharply, and the smell of wet metal filled the ranch. One night, I woke suddenly to the horses screaming inside the barn. Their hooves slammed violently against wood. Chains rattled. The clock beside my bed read 2:13 a.m. Then the humming began again, low enough to vibrate through the mattress. I sat upright slowly. My room looked pale beneath the moonlight. Dust drifted through the cold air, and outside the bedroom window, tap, tap, tap. I could hear breathing this time. Soft, wet, close to the glass. Every part of me wanted to stay still, but I moved toward the curtain anyway, my hands trembling against the fabric. The tapping stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Then I pulled the curtain aside. The figure stood only a few feet from the window, tall enough that its head nearly touched the top frame. The fog drifted around its body. Moonlight reflected faintly across pale skin. Its arms hung too long at its sides. Its shoulders bent strangely, and where its face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no mouth, no skin, only a flat stretch of pale emptiness staring directly into the room. The humming deepened. The window glass trembled softly. Then the figure slowly tilted its head, and the porch light went out. The footsteps began a week later, shortly after midnight, always after the humming started. At first, I thought branches were scraping across the roof. The wind had grown stronger that week. Cold air pushed dust beneath the doors and rattled the old gutters. But branches do not move with weight. These steps were slow, heavy, measured. Each one pressed through the ceiling above my bedroom. Thump, pause, thump. I lay awake beneath the blankets listening. The room smelled faintly of damp wood and cold dust. The old lamp beside the bed flickered weakly. The footsteps crossed from one end of the roof to the other, then stopped directly above me. Silence followed, not natural silence. The same dead stillness that arrived every night at 2:13. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I climbed into the attic. A narrow ladder folded down from the hallway ceiling. Rusty hinges screamed softly when I pulled it open. The attic air felt stale and freezing. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight. Spider webs hung from the rafters like torn fabric. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then I noticed the dust. Patterns stretched across the floorboards. Long, narrow trails where something had disturbed the surface. Not footprints. Not exactly. More like dragging marks, as if long fingers had slowly traced across the attic floor. I crouched beside one trail. The dust smelled burned, sharp enough to sting my nose. Above me, the roof gave a quiet creak. I left immediately. That night, the footsteps returned. Heavier now. The entire ceiling vibrated with each movement. Small flakes of dust drifted onto my blanket. The horses screamed inside the barn. Dogs barked somewhere far outside, then suddenly stopped all at once. The humming filled the walls again, low and steady, like distant machinery buried beneath the house. I stared at the ceiling while weak light flickered from the hallway. The footsteps moved slowly overhead, then stopped directly above my bed. The silence afterward felt unbearable. I could hear my own breathing, the pulse inside my ears, the faint crackle of old wiring inside the walls. Then came a new noise, scratching, soft at first, like fingernails sliding across wood. I sat upright immediately. The scratching moved slowly above me, dragging from one side of the ceiling to the other. Dust sprinkled onto my chest. The scratching paused. Then 3 slow knocks echoed from inside the ceiling itself. My throat tightened. I reached for the bedside lamp. The bulb flickered weakly before dimming again. The humming deepened. The walls vibrated hard enough to rattle picture frames. Then something shifted directly overhead. Heavy, careful. The ceiling bent inward slightly, just enough to notice. I could smell damper suddenly, wet and cold, like soil freshly dug from underground. The scratching resumed, closer now, directly above my face. I backed slowly away from the bed. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet. Another knock came from above. Then another, and another. The plaster cracked softly. A thin line spread across the ceiling. Dust poured downward in pale streams. The humming stopped instantly. Everything fell silent. Then something inside the ceiling exhaled. Long, slow, wet. I stood frozen in the dark, while cold air spread through the room. And above me, something began crawling carefully across the inside of the ceiling. The cattle were standing in the north pasture when I woke. Every single one of them. Dozens of dark shapes gathered together beneath the pale morning sky. Perfectly still. Cold wind moved through the grass. The fences creaked softly, but the herd did not react. I walked toward them slowly. Mud clung damp against my boots. The air smelled strange again, like smoke buried beneath wet dirt. Normally the cattle shifted when approached. They wandered, snorted, lifted their heads. Not this time. They stood frozen shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed toward the distant hills beyond the ranch boundary. I waved my arms. Nothing. I shouted. Nothing. Even when I touched one of them, the animal barely reacted. Its skin trembled beneath my hand. Warm breath escaped slowly from its nose, but its eyes never moved from the hills. The dogs refused to enter the pasture. They stayed near the fence, growling softly toward the distance, tails tucked low. Above us, the sky looked pale and colorless. Clouds drifted slowly over the hills where the lights first appeared. By evening, the cattle still had not moved. The horses inside the barn kicked nervously against their stalls. The humming started earlier than usual. Vibrations rolled faintly through the ground beneath my feet. As darkness spread across the ranch, I noticed lights descending beyond the tree line. 3 pale shapes, floating slowly downward through the fog. The cattle immediately stiffened. Every animal turned slightly toward the woods. Their breathing deepened. I could feel the vibration in the air now. Not loud, but everywhere. Inside the fences, inside the porch rails, inside my chest. The lights hovered just above the trees. Still, watching. I grabbed my flashlight and crossed the pasture. Dry grass brushed against my legs. The night air smelled burned and electrical. The deeper I walked, the quieter everything became. No insects, no wind, no distant animals. Only the humming, near the edge of the woods. My flashlight swept across the ground and stopped. Deep grooves had been burned into the earth. Massive lines cut through the dirt in perfect curves. Blackened soil steamed faintly in the freezing air. The grooves formed a circle nearly 30 feet wide. I crouched beside one mark. The dirt felt warm, too warm. Then the flashlight flickered. The humming deepened sharply. The trees around me vibrated softly. I looked up. The pale lights were gone. But something moved behind the tree line. Large, silent. Branches shifted carefully. Not from wind, from weight. I backed away slowly. The beam of my flashlight shook across the dark woods. For 1 second, I thought I saw a tall shape standing between the trees. Thin limbs, pale skin, no face. Then darkness swallowed it again. I returned to the house before midnight, locked every door, pulled the curtains shut. The cattle remained in the pasture all night, standing perfectly still beneath the pale sky. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the humming became almost unbearable. Glasses rattled inside the cabinets. The hallway light dimmed weakly. Then everything stopped. Silence crashed over the ranch. I looked outside through the kitchen window. The cattle were gone, every single one. The pasture sat empty beneath the moonlight. Fog drifted slowly over flattened grass. By sunrise, 3 cattle were still missing. No blood, no broken fences, no tracks leading away. Only deep circular marks pressed into the earth where they had once stood, and far beyond the hills. Pale lights hovered briefly against the fading dawn. The ranch radio sat on a shelf beside the fireplace. Old, dust-covered, barely working most days. It came with the house, along with the creaking pipes and warped floorboards and the smell of old smoke trapped inside the walls. I rarely touched it, until it turned on by itself. The first time happened shortly after midnight. A burst of static shattered the silence inside the living room. I nearly dropped the coffee cup in my hands. The radio hissed loudly. Dry, crackling noise filling the room while weak yellow light flickered overhead. Then it stopped. The house fell silent again. I unplugged the radio after that. But the next night, it happened again. This time the static lasted longer. The speaker crackled softly while cold air drifted beneath the windows. Outside, fog rolled slowly across the ranch fields. I stared at the unplugged cord hanging beside the shelf, my stomach tightening. The radio continued whispering static anyway. Then something shifted inside the noise. A voice, faint, distorted. I leaned closer. The speaker smelled hot and electrical. Dust trembled against the wooden shelf. The voice came again, soft, wet, as if spoken underwater. It whispered my name, slowly, carefully, again and again. Cold pressure spread through my chest. I stepped away from the shelf immediately. The voice faded back into static, then silence. That night, I barely slept. Every creak inside the house sounded heavier. Every shadow along the hallway looked wrong. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the humming returned. The windows vibrated faintly. Somewhere above the ceiling, slow footsteps crossed the roof. Then the radio turned on again. Static burst through the dark house. Louder this time. Aggressive. I walked into the living room carefully. The floor felt cold beneath my feet. The speaker crackled violently. Words drifted in and out of the noise. Broken, warped, more than one voice now, whispering together. The sounds reminded me of distant people speaking through water. Mechanical, breathing between syllables. Then one sentence became clear. Do not look outside. The voice repeated it slowly. Again and again. Do not look outside. The hallway light dimmed. The humming deepened inside the walls. I should have listened. Instead, I moved toward the kitchen window. My pulse hammered painfully inside my ears. Behind me, the radio continued whispering, "Do not look outside." The closer I came to the window, the colder the air became. Frost spread faintly across the edges of the glass. I pulled the curtain aside. At first, I saw only fog. Pale moonlight, the outline of fences disappearing into darkness. Then the lights appeared, dozens of them, hovering low above the fields. Pale white shapes drifting silently over the ranch. Some moved slowly between the cattle pens. Others floated motionless above the pasture. The humming became unbearable. My teeth vibrated. The glass trembled beneath my fingers. And standing beneath the largest light was a tall figure, motionless, watching the house. Its pale body reflected weakly through the fog, long arms hanging at unnatural angles. The radio behind me suddenly screamed with static. I turned sharply. The speaker crackled violently enough to shake the shelf. Then every voice whispered at once. Too late. The house lights went black instantly. Outside the window, the pale lights drifted closer through the fog, and something tapped softly against the glass. The barn door was open again when I woke. Cold morning air drifted through the entrance. Loose chains swayed softly from the ceiling beams. The smell of damp hay and mud filled the dark interior. I knew I had locked it the night before. I remembered the weight of the iron chain in my hands, the sharp click of the padlock closing. But now the lock hung open, covered in black dirt. The horses refused to go near the doorway. They pulled hard against their reins. Warm breath burst wildly from their noses. Inside the barn, muddy trails stretched across the wooden floor, long streaks leading toward the empty cattle stalls. Not footprints, not tire marks, more like something heavy dragged slowly through the mud. I followed the trails deeper inside. The old boards creaked beneath my boots. Dust floated through pale beams of morning light. The smell changed near the back stalls. Wet soil, rust, and something burned. The mud trail stopped beside the metal wall. That was where I noticed the marks. Long claw-like grooves carved deep into the steel. Blackened edges curled outward as if the metal had melted. I touched one carefully. The surface felt warm. A low vibration hummed faintly through the wall. I stepped back immediately. That evening, the dogs refused to enter the barn. No matter how hard I called them, They stood outside, growling softly toward the darkness, ears flattened, bodies trembling. The sun disappeared behind the hills. Fog rolled low across the pasture, and somewhere far above the ranch, pale lights drifted silently between the clouds. The humming began shortly after midnight. I sat awake near the kitchen table, listening to the walls vibrate. The radio remained silent for once, but the stillness felt worse somehow. Then I heard breathing, slow, deep, coming from the barn. I froze. The sound drifted faintly through the cold night air. Not animal breathing. Too uneven, too heavy. I grabbed the flashlight beside the door, my hands already shaking. Outside, frost covered the porch rails. The ranch looked pale beneath the moonlight. Every fence post cast long shadows through the fog. The breathing continued. I crossed the yard slowly. Dry grass cracked beneath my boots. The barn door stood half open again, moving gently in the wind. Inside, darkness swallowed almost everything. The flashlight beam swept across old tools, empty stalls, rust hanging from chains near the ceiling. Then the beam flickered. The humming deepened immediately. The metal walls vibrated softly. Somewhere inside the darkness, something moved, a slow shift behind the hanging chains. I stopped breathing. The flashlight trembled in my hand. The movement came again, careful, heavy. The chains clinked softly together. Then silence. The air inside the barn felt painfully cold now. My breath drifted pale in front of my face. I raised the flashlight higher. For 1 second, the beam caught part of a figure standing behind the chains. Long pale limbs, bent shoulders, skin reflecting weakly like wet paper. Then the light flickered out completely. In the darkness, something inhaled sharply. Right in front of me, the storm arrived just before dusk. Dark clouds rolled across the hills while cold rain hammered the ranch roof. The windows rattled softly beneath heavy wind. I needed supplies. The pantry sat nearly empty, and staying inside the house another night felt worse than driving through the storm. The old truck barely started. The engine coughed weakly while rainwater slid across the windshield. I left Black Hollow Ranch just after sunset. The dirt road disappeared beneath thick mud. Lightning flashed pale across the empty fields. Every fence line looked twisted beneath the storm. The radio played faint static most of the drive, broken voices drifting in and out between bursts of noise. About 15 miles from town, I passed the abandoned windmill, tall, rust-covered, standing alone beside the road. The moment I drove past it, the truck radio died. Not static, not fading. Silence. Even the headlights dimmed. Rain hammered harder against the glass. The engine vibrated strangely beneath my feet. Then the humming started, low, deep, coming from somewhere outside the truck. I slowed instinctively. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Ahead of me, the road suddenly flooded with white light, blinding. The entire desert vanished beneath it. The windshield glowed so brightly I could barely see. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded sideways through mud. And then, nothing. I woke with my forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The storm was gone. Complete silence surrounded the truck. No rain, no thunder, no wind. My watch read 3:14 a.m. For a moment, I could not breathe. The truck sat parked beside an empty stretch of road. But the windmill was gone. The ranch road was gone. I stepped outside slowly. Cold air wrapped around me immediately. The desert smelled wet and metallic. Moonlight stretched across endless dry fields. I did not recognize where I was. Mud covered my boots nearly to the knees. Thick black dirt dried along my jeans. I could not remember leaving the truck. The engine still idled softly. Headlights pointed toward nothing but open land. Then I noticed the truck door. Symbols had been scratched into the paint. Long curved marks crossing over each other in strange patterns. The metal around them looked burned. I stared at the marks while cold pressure spread through my chest. The humming echoed faintly somewhere far overhead. When I finally reached town, nobody mentioned the storm. One cashier looked confused when I asked about it. "Storm," he whispered, outside the store windows. The sky remained perfectly clear. I returned to the ranch before dawn. The dirt road looked untouched by rain, dry, silent. The moment I stepped inside the house, I noticed clock. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped completely. Its hands rested at exactly 2:13 a.m. The air inside the ranch felt colder than before. The walls vibrated faintly beneath the silence, and from somewhere deep below the floorboards, the humming slowly returned. The unused bedroom sat at the far end of the hallway. I avoided it most nights. The air inside always felt colder. Still, like the room itself had been abandoned for years. One evening, while checking windows before bed, I noticed a view beyond the glass. The desert stretched endlessly behind the ranch. Flat land, dry brush, and distant hills buried beneath fog. Far out near the horizon, pale lights moved slowly through the darkness. At first, I thought they were stars. But stars do not drift across the ground. I stood at the window for several minutes watching them. Tiny white shapes floating silently over the desert. The glass felt freezing beneath my fingers. The room smelled faintly of dust and old fabric. Every night afterward, the lights appeared closer, slowly, carefully. By the fourth night, they hovered beyond the ranch fence. By the sixth, they drifted near the dry field behind the barn. The humming grew louder whenever they appeared. Weak vibrations spread through the hallway walls. The ceiling lights flickered softly. I stopped sleeping properly after that. At exactly 2:13 each morning, I woke to the same feeling, like someone standing quietly beside the bed, watching. One night, I returned to the unused room just after midnight. Fog pressed heavily against the outside glass. Moonlight barely reached the desert beyond. The lights were gone. For a moment, relief settled through me. Then I noticed a shape, standing directly outside the window. Tall, motionless, its pale body blended into the fog. Long arms hanging beside narrow legs. I could not see its face, only the outline. Cold spread painfully through my chest. I stepped backward slowly. Then something moved strangely. Not the figure, its reflection in the glass. The pale shape tilted its head slowly to one side. Outside the window, the figure remained perfectly still. My stomach dropped. The reflection smiled. But the figure outside never moved. I stumbled backward hard enough to hit the wall. The humming deepened instantly. The room lights dimmed. When I looked back toward the glass, the figure was gone. Only fog drifted outside. The next morning, I nailed a heavy blanket across the window, covered every edge, blocked the desert from view. But the tapping started that night anyway. Soft, steady, coming directly from the other side of the covered glass. Tap, tap, tap. It continued until sunrise. I met the old ranch owner during the first snowfall. Thin white flakes drifted across the fields while freezing wind rattled the fences. The ranch looked buried beneath ash. He arrived just before sunset, driving slowly through the snow in an old pickup truck. I almost did not recognize him. His face looked thinner than before, pale, exhausted, but it was his eyes that unsettled me. Dark circles hung beneath them like bruises, the kind left behind after years without rest. He carried an old radio scanner beneath one arm, its antenna bent sideways, static crackling softly through the speaker. We sat near the fireplace while snow tapped gently against the windows. The house smelled of smoke and coal dust. For a long time, he said nothing, only listened to the scanner, then quietly whispered, "I haven't slept properly in 12 years." The fire cracked softly between us. Outside, the wind howled across the ranch. He stared toward the dark hallway, while static drifted through the room. "If you dream here," he continued softly, "they come closer." I asked who he meant, but he only shook his head. That night, he stayed awake beside the radio scanner, listening. Every few minutes, strange bursts of noise crackled through the speaker, distorted breathing, faint clicking sounds, numbers spoken in broken whispers. The old man wrote notes constantly, his shaking hands filling entire pages. Around midnight, the humming returned. The windows vibrated lightly. Snow drifted sideways through darkness outside. The old man stiffened immediately. "Don't answer them," he whispered. I looked toward him. If you hear voices outside after midnight, don't answer. His face looked terrified, not confused, not paranoid, terrified. At 2:13 a.m., the house fell silent again. No wind, no crackling fire, no static. Then came a voice from outside, soft, faint, calling from somewhere near the barn. It sounded almost human. The old man lowered his head immediately. His hands trembled around the radio scanner. The voice called again, long and distant through the snow. This time it sounded closer. Near the porch, I moved toward the window instinctively, but the old man grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Don't," he whispered. The voice continued for several minutes, sometimes sounding male, sometimes female, sometimes almost like my own. Then suddenly it stopped. The humming faded shortly afterward. The wind slowly returned across the ranch. Near dawn, exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. When I woke, the old man was gone. The front door stood open slightly. Snow drifted across the porch. Outside, no footprints led away from the house. Only his flashlight remained, still glowing weakly in the snow, pointing toward the distant hills. The glowing cracks appeared 3 nights after the old man vanished. At first, I thought moonlight reflected strangely across the fields, thin pale lines stretching through the dirt. But moonlight does not pulse. The cracks glowed softly beneath the earth, blue-white light leaking upward through the soil. I walked into the south field just after midnight. Cold wind brushed through dry grass. The ranch behind me looked distant and small. The humming filled the ground beneath my boots. Steady, mechanical, like enormous machinery buried far below the ranch. The cracks spread across the field in twisting lines, some only inches long, others stretching several feet through the dirt. Warm air rose faintly from them. The smell reminded me of burned metal after lightning strikes. I crouched beside one glowing line. The soil vibrated gently beneath my hand. Then something beneath the ground shifted. The movement was subtle, but enough to make the dirt tremble. I stumbled backward immediately. The humming deepened. Somewhere far above the clouds, pale lights moved silently across the sky. The next night, I returned with shovel. I do not know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe exhaustion, maybe the feeling that the ranch itself wanted me to dig. The cold air burned inside my lungs while I worked. Each strike of the shovel echoed strangely through the silent field. Only a few feet below the surface, the metal appeared, smooth, silver, curving downward into darkness. No rust, no scratches. The surface reflected pale light across my face. I reached down carefully. The metal felt warm despite the freezing night air, warm enough that I jerked my hand away instantly. The humming became painfully loud. My teeth vibrated. The ground beneath me trembled softly. Then the lights above the ranch stopped moving. Every pale shape in the sky hovered motionless, watching. Fear finally pushed me back toward the house. I left the shovel buried beside the hole, the field glowing faintly behind me. That night, I could not sleep. The humming spread through the walls, through the pipes, through the bed frame itself. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the floorboards beneath the bedroom began vibrating violently. Books fell from shelves. The hallway mirror cracked sharply down the center. Dust poured from the ceiling. The entire ranch groaned like something enormous shifting underground. Then came a deep metallic noise. Not from outside, from beneath the house. A massive grinding sound. Slow, ancient, as if something buried below Black Hollow Ranch had finally started waking up. The radio tower stood beyond the western hills. I had seen it before during supply runs. A thin, rusted structure rising above the fog, like a dead tree. Nobody in town talked about it. But 3 nights after the ground beneath the ranch began vibrating, the tower started transmitting again. The first signal came through the ranch radio shortly after midnight. Static burst suddenly through the living room, sharp enough to wake me from sleep. Then came breathing, slow, distorted. The speaker crackled, while weak moonlight spilled through the windows. The air inside the house smelled faintly electrical. At first, I thought it was wind interference. Then numbers began repeating through the static, broken whispers, spoken carefully between long breaths. I could not understand all of them, but one sequence repeated over and over. 2:15. The humming inside the walls deepened immediately. The kitchen light flickered weakly. Outside, the dogs began barking violently toward the hills. Then they stopped all at once. Complete silence spread across the ranch. The next morning, I found the north pasture empty. Birds, dogs, even the cattle had moved away from the western fence line. The entire side of the ranch felt abandoned. That evening, fog rolled heavily across the hills, thick enough to hide the tower completely. But the signal continued. Static whispered through the radio nonstop, distorted breathing filling the house. I finally grabbed my flashlight and drove toward the hills just before midnight. The dirt road twisted through dry brush and broken fences. Cold fog pressed against the windshield. The truck headlights barely reached beyond the hood. The closer I came to the tower, the louder the humming became. Not through the radio, through the ground. When I reached the base of the hill, the truck engine died completely. I continued on foot. Wet grass brushed against my boots. The fog swallowed every sound beyond a few feet. Then the tower appeared, tall, rust-covered, standing silently above the hills. The station building beside it looked abandoned. Windows shattered, door hanging open. Inside, dust covered everything. Old papers scattered across the floor. The smell of mold and rust lingered in the cold air. Against one wall, faded photographs hung crookedly. Black Hollow Ranch. Dozens of old pictures. Some looked decades old, others newer. Every photograph showed pale lights hovering above the ranch fields. In one picture, tall figures stood near the water tower, thin shapes blurred by fog. My stomach tightened. The radio signal crackled loudly from another room. I followed it slowly. An old transmitter sat humming weakly in the darkness. Wires stretched across the floor like veins. The speaker hissed sharply. Then the breathing returned. Closer now. Suddenly something struck the tower outside. Metal screamed loudly overhead. I froze. Another impact echoed upward through the structure. Heavy, violent. Something was climbing the tower. Slowly, I backed toward the doorway, the flashlight beam shaking across the walls. Outside, the fog shifted around the tower legs. And far above me, something pale moved upward through the darkness. Long limbs wrapping carefully around the metal. Climbing higher, toward the top of the tower. Snow covered the ranch by morning. Thin white layers stretched across the fences and fields. The trees stood frozen beneath pale gray sky. For the first time in weeks, everything looked quiet, still, almost peaceful. Then I saw the footprints. They circled the house completely. Long, narrow tracks pressed deeply into the snow. Too large for coyotes, too thin for human feet. The prints looped around the ranch house again and again, never wandering, never stopping, just circling. Cold pressure settled through my chest while I followed them. The snow crunched softly beneath my boots. The air smelled sharp and clean. Every trail ended beneath my bedroom window. The snow there had melted slightly, black earth showing through beneath the ice. I stepped backward slowly. The curtains inside the bedroom shifted faintly, as if something had been standing there moments earlier. That night, the dogs hid beneath the kitchen table. They refused to go outside, even when I opened the door. The humming began earlier than usual, low vibrations rolling through the pipes and walls. Around midnight, snow started falling again, soft flakes drifting past the windows. I kept checking the footprints outside, expecting them to disappear beneath fresh snow, but they remained. At exactly 2:13 a.m., tapping echoed above the ceiling. Slow, measured, I looked toward the hallway immediately. The lights dimmed weakly overhead. Then came footsteps on the roof. Heavy, dragging. The dogs whimpered beneath the table, their bodies shaking violently. I moved toward the window carefully. Cold air seeped through the glass. Outside, fresh snow covered the ranch. Pale moonlight reflected across the empty fields. Then I noticed new footprints. On the roof, long narrow tracks crossing the snow above the bedroom. No ladder leaned against the house. No broken branches nearby. Only impossible footprints leading slowly across the roofline. The footsteps overhead stopped directly above me, Silence followed. Then 3 slow taps came from inside the ceiling. The dogs began crying softly, and something shifted carefully above the plaster. The woman first appeared during heavy fog near the south road. I saw her just before dawn, standing barefoot beside the fence line. Thin white mist drifted around her body. Her pale dress moved gently in the cold wind. At first, I thought she was lost. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The gravel road crunched beneath my boots. The air smelled wet and bitter. The woman stood perfectly still, long dark hair hanging across part of her face. I called out once. She did not answer. The closer I walked, the colder the air became. Frost formed faintly along the fence wire. Then the fog thickened suddenly, swallowing the road. And when it cleared again, she was gone. No footprints. No sound. Nothing. Later that day, one of the men in town finally spoke about her. Quietly, without looking directly at me. He claimed a woman disappeared near Black Hollow Ranch years ago, during the nights when strange lights filled the valley. They never found her, he whispered. After that, I began dreaming about her constantly, always standing beside the water tower, always surrounded by fog. Sometimes she looked frightened, sometimes sad, but every dream ended the same way. She would slowly raise one hand toward the hills, then whisper something I could never fully hear. The nights grew colder after that, the humming louder. One evening, while checking the barn doors before midnight, I noticed movement inside the shadows. The horses stomped nervously. Chains rattled softly overhead. Then I saw her, standing near the empty stalls. The pale woman. She had not opened the barn door. I would have heard it. Yet there she stood quietly beneath weak lantern light, fog drifting around her bare feet. Her skin looked almost translucent, moonlight passing faintly through the edges of her dress. I could not move. The humming vibrated painfully through the barn walls. The horses trembled violently behind me. The woman slowly turned her head, dark, tired eyes meeting mine. Then she whispered softly, "They're almost here." Her voice sounded distant, like hearing someone speak underwater. Before I could answer, the lantern light flickered. The fog inside the barn thickened suddenly, and when it cleared, she was gone. Only cold air remained drifting through the empty stalls. The silence arrived just after midnight. Not gradual, not natural. One moment, wind scraped softly across the ranch fences. The next, everything stopped. No insects, no shifting trees, no distant cattle. Even my footsteps sounded muted against the wooden floor. I stood near the kitchen window, listening to the stillness press against the house. The air felt heavy, almost thick. Outside, fog spread low across the fields. Moonlight barely reached the hills. Then the humming began, louder than ever before. The walls vibrated violently. Glasses rattled inside the cabinets. The floor beneath my feet trembled softly. At exactly 2:13 a.m., every clock inside the ranch stopped. The silence deepened. Then the sky changed. Far above the western hills, pale light slowly spread through the clouds. Not lightning, not moonlight, something opening. The shape widened gradually across the darkness. A glowing wound stretching through the sky. Cold air rushed suddenly across the ranch. The smell of burned metal filled the fields. I stepped onto the porch, unable to look away. The pale opening above the hills pulsed softly. Blue-white light spilling downward through clouds. Then beams descended toward the earth. Thin columns of pale light reaching silently into the fields below. Where each beam touched the ground, fog curled upward like smoke. The cattle fences vibrated softly. Dry grass bent flat against the dirt. Something moved inside the nearest beam. Tall, thin, walking slowly toward the ranch. Its outline shifted unnaturally inside the glowing light. Long limbs unfolding carefully through the fog. More shapes appeared behind it. Dozens. The humming became unbearable. The porch boards trembled beneath my feet. Then the nearest figure stopped, directly beyond the fence line, watching the house. The pale light above the hills widened further, stretching across the clouds like an opening door. And somewhere inside that terrible brightness, something enormous moved, slowly descending toward Black Hollow Ranch. I found the tapes beneath the bedroom floorboards. The wood had loosened near the corner wall. One plank lifted easier than the others. Inside the hidden space sat a small metal box, dust-covered, cold to the touch. 3 cassette tapes rested inside, along with an old recorder. The labels were faded, most of the writing nearly unreadable. Only one sentence remained clear: "If anything happens to me, do not follow the lights." Cold rain tapped softly against the windows while I carried the box downstairs. The ranch smelled damp and old. Outside, pale fog drifted slowly across the fields. The first tape crackled loudly when it began. A man's voice filled the room. Weak, exhausted, the former ranch owner. His breathing sounded uneven, every few words interrupted by static. "They keep calling from the fields," he whispered. "They sound human at first, but they aren't." The tape hissed sharply, then continued. He described lights moving across the ranch every night. Voices outside the windows. Footsteps on the roof. The same things I had already seen. My hands tightened around the recorder. The humming inside the walls grew faintly louder. On the second tape, the ranch owner sounded frightened, more distant. "There's something beneath the house," he whispered. "I can feel it waking up." Behind his voice, another noise echoed faintly through the recording, a low mechanical hum. And somewhere far away, screaming wind, the sound raised cold bumps across my arms. Then came the final tape. For several seconds, only static played, soft crackling filling the dark living room. Then the ranch owner whispered quietly, "They're inside the house." The tape abruptly distorted. A violent burst of humming swallowed the recording. Furniture crashed somewhere in the background. Then silence. The tape ended. At that exact moment, the power inside the ranch failed. The lights vanished instantly. Darkness flooded the house. Outside, pale fog pressed against the windows. The humming returned louder than ever before. Then footsteps crossed slowly over the roof. Heavy, measured. I stood frozen beside the recorder while cold air spread through the hallway. And from somewhere outside the bedroom window, something whispered my name. The cornfield sat behind the eastern fence line. Most of it had dried long before winter arrived. Tall, brittle stalks stood motionless beneath the gray sky. The field stretched farther than it should have. I avoided it after dark. But every night, something moved inside it. The rustling usually started shortly after midnight, soft at first, like wind brushing through dead leaves. Except the air outside remained perfectly still. I would stand at the kitchen window listening, the dry stalks shifting slowly against one another. The sound carried across the frozen fields like whispering voices. Then came the clicking, sharp, uneven, not animal sounds, not insects. The noises echoed deep inside the cornfield after 2:13 a.m., sometimes close together, sometimes spread far apart, like several things communicating through the dark. One night I saw the eyes, pale glowing shapes hidden between the stalks, too high above the ground to belong to coyotes. They blinked slowly, watching the ranch house. The humming inside the walls deepened immediately. The porch light flickered weakly. Then the eyes vanished deeper into the field. The next morning, 2 calves were missing. Broken fences surrounded the pasture. Mud covered the frozen ground. But no tracks led away, only crushed stalks disappearing into the cornfield. I waited until dusk before following them. The cold air smelled dry and burned. The corn brushed loudly against my coat as I stepped inside. Within a few feet, the ranch disappeared behind me. The stalks swallowed everything. The clicking returned almost immediately. Closer now, moving slowly through the rows. I turned sharply several times. But each time I found only darkness between the stalks. The flashlight beam shook in my hands. Dust and dead leaves drifted through the pale light. Then I noticed the silence. No wind. No distant animals. No movement except the corn itself. Something large shifted somewhere ahead, heavy enough to bend the stalks. I froze, my breath drifting pale in front of me. The movement stopped. Then came a low clicking sound directly beside my ear. I stumbled backward violently. The flashlight beam swept across the stalks. For one terrible second, I saw a pale shape standing only a few feet away. Tall, thin, its body hidden between the dry corn, glowing eyes reflecting weakly through the darkness. Then it vanished deeper into the field. I ran after it without thinking, the stalks tearing against my arms, cold dirt slipping beneath my boots. Suddenly the corn opened into a clearing. A perfect circle of flattened crops stretched before me. The stalks bent outward evenly against blackened earth. Burn marks covered the ground. Deep grooves carved into the frozen soil. And in the center of the clearing, the earth still glowed faintly beneath the dark. The humming became painfully loud. Somewhere behind me, the clicking started again, only this time it came from all directions. The dogs began barking at the sky 3 nights later. Not toward the hills, not toward the cornfield, upward. Every evening just after sunset, they gathered near the barn, growling and barking into the empty darkness above the ranch. Their fur stood stiff along their backs. Warm breath burst wildly through the cold air. Even the horses grew restless when it happened. Chains rattled inside the stalls. Hooves slammed nervously against wood. The storm arrived shortly after midnight. Black clouds swallowed the stars. Lightning flashed silently behind the hills. The humming spread through the air itself. Not through the walls anymore. Not beneath the floor. Everywhere. The dogs barked harder than ever, running wildly across the yard, their cries echoing through the rain. Then the pale lights appeared above the ranch. Huge glowing shapes drifting silently through the storm clouds. Blue-white light pulsing behind heavy rain. The dogs suddenly stopped barking. For 1 second, the ranch became completely silent. Then every dog vanished. No running footsteps. No cries. No movement. Just empty darkness where they had stood. Lightning flashed again. The yard remained deserted. I ran outside immediately. Cold rain soaked through my clothes. Mud splashed beneath my boots. I shouted their names into the storm. Nothing answered. Near the barn, deep circular marks pressed into the wet earth. Perfect burned rings steaming beneath the rain. The humming overhead deepened. Then came a howling. Distant, mournful, not from the fields. From somewhere above the clouds. I looked upward slowly. Rain stung against my face. The pale lights drifted silently through the storm. The howling echoed again, long and broken through the sky. By dawn, the dogs were still gone. No tracks led away from the ranch. No blood. No torn fences. Only silence. I sat on the porch long after sunrise staring toward the hills. The ranch felt emptier than before. Then something struck the roof above me softly. I looked up. One of the dog collars slid slowly down the wet shingles. Rainwater dripped from the rusted buckle. The leather smell burned. And far overhead, the pale lights disappeared quietly behind the clouds. I began waking at exactly 2:13 every morning. Always the same way. Cold air filling the bedroom. The humming vibrating faintly through the walls. And the silhouette standing in the hallway. At first, it remained near the far end, barely visible beyond the bedroom door, a tall dark shape, perfectly motionless. I told myself it was exhaustion, shadows, fear, but each night it appeared closer, never moving while I watched, never making a sound. It simply stood there, waiting in the dark hallway. The ranch had grown painfully cold by then. Frost crept along the inside windows. The pipes groaned constantly beneath the floor. One night, I forced myself to step closer. The hallway smelled damp, like wet soil trapped beneath old wood. The silhouette remained still, its outline barely visible against the darkness. Then the hallway light flickered weakly overhead. For a brief second, I saw its body clearly. The limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Its arms nearly touched the floor. The joints bent at unnatural angles beneath pale, stretched skin. The light died again immediately. Darkness swallowed the hallway. My pulse hammered painfully inside my ears. Cold breath drifted from my mouth. Then the humming stopped. Silence filled the ranch. The silhouette stood only a few feet away now. I could feel it somehow, even without seeing it clearly. The air around the shape felt colder than ice, sharp enough to burn my skin. I backed slowly toward the bedroom. The floor creaked beneath my feet. The figure did not move. Then the bedroom door creaked softly, slowly opening wider on its own. The darkness behind the silhouette deepened, almost liquid, and somewhere inside that darkness, something breathed. I returned to the abandoned windmill after the dreams began. Every night, I saw the same place. Black dirt, pale lights, something standing motionless beneath the spinning blades. By morning, exhaustion pressed behind my eyes like fever. The road toward the windmill looked deserted beneath heavy fog. Dry brush scraped softly against the truck. When I finally reached the hill, I saw the circle immediately, burned into the earth beside the windmill, perfectly round. The blackened ground stretched nearly 40 feet wide. No grass grew inside it. No snow remained. The air smelled electrical, sharp enough to sting my nose. I stepped closer carefully. Cold winds circled the hill. The old windmill groaned softly overhead. Inside the burn circle, my compass stopped working. The needle spun wildly before freezing completely. The humming beneath the earth grew stronger. My ears rang painfully. Then the vision started. At first, only flashes. Pale lights descending through fog. Dark figures standing around the circle. Then something worse. People, dozens of them, standing silently beneath the lights. Faces empty. Eyes fixed upward. I stumbled backward hard enough to fall. The images vanished instantly. My hands shook violently. Cold sweat clung to my neck despite the freezing air. That night, I returned again. I do not know why. Maybe because the ranch no longer felt real. Maybe because part of me already understood something terrible waited beneath the hills. Blue lights rotated silently above the burned circle, slowly drifting through the fog. The windmill blades no longer moved, yet a low, grinding noise echoed through the hill. I searched a nearby town records days later. Old newspaper clippings hidden inside dusty boxes. Disappearances, missing ranchers, missing travelers, missing children, all connected to the same stretch of land near Black Hollow Ranch. Some reports dated back nearly 70 years. The final report mentioned strange lights above the windmill, then abruptly stopped. That night, I found footprints leading into the burn circle. Fresh tracks pressed deeply into the black earth. Long, narrow prints. Only one trail. No tracks leading back out. The humming deepened immediately, and somewhere above the fog, blue light slowly began descending toward the hill. The figure appeared beside the south fence every night after that, always at the same time, 2:13 a.m. I would wake to the humming vibrating through the house, then see it standing beyond the pasture, watching. At first, the distance made it difficult to understand what I was seeing. Tall, pale, motionless, but over several nights, I began noticing details. Its proportions were wrong. The arms hung too low. The torso bent strangely. The neck looked too long beneath its narrow head. Moonlight reflected across pale skin that seemed almost wet. Yet the figure never crossed the fence line. It simply stood there staring toward the ranch house. The electricity inside the home flickered whenever it appeared. Lights dimmed softly. The radio crackled with static. One night, I brought binoculars onto the porch. Cold fog drifted low across the pasture. The air smelled burned and metallic. The figure stood beside the broken fence post. Perfectly still, I raised the binoculars slowly. The closer view made my stomach tighten immediately. Its skin looked smooth, almost translucent beneath the moonlight. No visible hair. No clear facial features. Only shallow depressions where eyes should have been. Its chest moved slowly, breathing. The humming deepened around the ranch. The porch boards vibrated beneath my boots. Then the figure raised one arm, slowly, carefully. Its fingers were impossibly long, jointed strangely beneath pale skin. The moment its hand pointed toward the house, every light inside the ranch failed. Darkness swallowed the property instantly. The humming became deafening. The walls groaned softly. I lowered the binoculars sharply. The figure was gone. Only fog drifted beside the fence line. Then came tapping from the kitchen window. Soft, patient, 3 slow knocks. And outside the glass, something pale moved carefully through the dark. I discovered the staircase after the storm. The barn floor had started shifting beneath the cattle stalls. Loose boards creaked strangely whenever I crossed them. The humming below the ground had become impossible to ignore. One night, shortly after 2:13 a.m., something knocked beneath the floor. 3 slow impacts, heavy enough to shake dust from the rafters. The horses screamed immediately. Chains rattled violently through the darkness. I grabbed a lantern and returned to the barn before dawn. Cold fog drifted through the open doorway. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Near the back stalls, I noticed scrape marks beside the floorboards. Fresh, deep, I pried the loose boards upward carefully. Rusty nails screamed against the wood. Beneath them sat a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Cold air rushed upward from below. Damp, metallic, the humming deepened immediately, strong enough to vibrate through my chest. I descended slowly. The lantern light shook across concrete walls. Moisture dripped somewhere deep underground. The tunnel stretched farther than it should have. Long rusted pipes lined the ceiling. Old electrical cables hung loose against the walls. Then I noticed the markings. Faded military symbols painted across heavy steel doors. Most nearly erased by age. Dust covered everything, but not all of it. Fresh footprints crossed the concrete floor. Long, narrow tracks leading deeper underground. The air smelled burned, like overheated machinery. Farther down the tunnel, old tables and rusted equipment filled a large chamber. Broken radios, metal containers, yellowed paper scattered across the floor. I picked up one faded document. Most of the words had become unreadable, but one sentence remained clear. Recovered aerial objects transported beneath Black Hollow sector. Cold pressure tightened through my chest. The humming suddenly became deafening. The lantern flickered violently. At the far end of the chamber stood massive steel doors buried partially beneath cracked concrete. Something moved behind them, a slow metallic shift. Then, knocking. 3 heavy impacts from the other side. Dust rained from the ceiling. The doors trembled softly. Another knock followed. Slower, stronger. I backed away immediately. The humming vibrated through the entire tunnel now. Then something scraped against the steel from within, long, careful, like fingers dragging slowly across metal. The lantern light dimmed sharply, and somewhere beyond those buried doors, something breathed. I first saw it standing near the north pasture. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the kitchen window. Then I realized a figure stood outside, motionless, watching the house. Moonlight reflected across wet grass. Fog drifted low across the fences. The figure looked exactly like me. Same coat, same posture, same face. Cold spread through my stomach instantly. I stepped backward from the window. The figure copied the movement, but not immediately. A second too late. My pulse hammered painfully inside my ears. The humming inside the walls deepened softly. I raised one trembling hand. Outside, the duplicate slowly mirrored the motion. Delayed. Wrong. Its smile appeared a moment before mine did. I stumbled away from the window. The figure remained standing in the pasture, perfectly still once again. After that night, the ranch changed. Reflections no longer matched reality. Mirrors inside the house seemed slower. Sometimes my reflection blinked after I did. Sometimes it smiled faintly while my own face remained still. The hallway mirror cracked further each morning. Dark shapes moved faintly inside the broken glass. Then the whispers started, soft voices drifting through empty rooms, calling my name from behind closed doors. At night, I heard footsteps moving to the hallway while I remained alone inside the bedroom. Slow, careful steps, stopping directly outside the door. One evening, I caught my reflection standing still in the bathroom mirror, even though I had already stepped away. Its pale face stared directly toward me, smiling. The lights flickered violently. The humming surged through the walls. Then the reflection whispered softly, "You already let us in." The mirror shattered instantly. Glass exploded across the sink. I staggered backward into the hallway. Cold air rushed through the house. The whispers grew louder from every direction. Outside the living room window, something moved across the pasture. The duplicate, walking slowly through the fog. Its movements looked smoother now, more natural than mine. It stopped near the fence line, then smiled broadly toward the house. And even from that distance, I could see its teeth were far too long. The stars changed first. One evening, while standing on the porch, I noticed the constellations no longer matched the sky I remembered. Shapes drifted slowly across the darkness, moving when they should not move. The moon flickered faintly overhead, like a dying bulb struggling to stay lit. The ranch felt wrong after that. Time stretched strangely inside the house. Minutes passed too quickly, then entire hours vanished without warning. The clocks no longer worked at all. Every one of them remained frozen at 2:13. Outside, dawn stopped arriving properly. One morning, darkness lingered across the ranch for nearly 6 hours past sunrise. The sky remained black and endless above the fields. The cattle stood silently beside the fences, watching upward. Even the wind seemed slower. Heavy, the humming had become constant now, low vibrations lingering inside the air itself. I stopped sleeping completely. Whenever I closed my eyes, I dreamed of enormous shapes moving behind clouds, ancient things drifting silently above the earth. One night, the clouds finally opened. Not fully, just enough. A massive silhouette moved slowly behind them, far larger than anything I could understand. The shape stretched across half the sky, long curved edges sliding silently through the darkness. No lights, no sound, only impossible size. The stars disappeared behind it one by one. I stood frozen in the yard while frost spread across the grass. The air smelled burned and empty. Then the silhouette stopped directly above Black Hollow Ranch. The humming deepened into something almost alive, a vibration so powerful it blurred my vision. And somewhere inside the clouds, something opened, a pale circular glow forming slowly in the darkness overhead. Watching. The emergency broadcast began 3 nights later. The ranch radio activated by itself shortly after sunset. Static filled the living room, while weak fog pressed against the windows. Then a voice broke through the noise. Distorted, panicked, all nearby residents are advised to avoid the Black Hollow region immediately. The message repeated constantly, interrupted by bursts of static and strange humming sounds. The town roads emptied soon afterward. I drove into town once more for supplies. Every store looked abandoned, windows boarded, cars missing. One gas station radio whispered reports from nearby valleys. People hearing voices from the sky. People waking with missing hours. People disappearing during pale lights over the hills. The cashier refused to look toward me. His hand shook constantly. "You need to leave that ranch," he whispered. I tried. Just before midnight, I packed the truck and drove south. Fog swallowed the road behind me. The humming followed through the darkness. For nearly an hour, the road stretched empty beneath the headlights. Then suddenly, the ranch appeared ahead again. The same broken fences, the same mailbox. I stopped breathing. I turned around immediately, drove east this time. Faster, the road twisted through endless desert. Dry brush scraped beneath the truck. Then once again, Black Hollow Ranch stood ahead of me. The porch light flickered weakly through the fog. Every road led back. By dawn, I stopped trying. The humming had become constant inside the air itself, strong enough to vibrate through my teeth. The emergency radio continued broadcasting throughout the day. Warnings, missing persons reports, static. Then, shortly after midnight, the final transmission arrived. The voice sounded terrified, barely human beneath the distortion. They're everywhere now. Screaming erupted somewhere behind the speaker. Loud metallic crashing. Then the humming overwhelmed everything. Violent static burst through the ranch house. The final voice whispered only 3 words. They opened it. Then silence. The radio died completely. Outside the windows, pale light slowly filled the valley. The final night arrived without wind, without insects, without even the distant groaning fences. Black Hollow Ranch sat beneath complete silence. The power failed shortly after midnight. Every light vanished at once. Darkness covered the house, while pale fog drifted slowly through the fields. Then the humming began, stronger than ever before. The walls shook violently. The windows trembled inside their frames. Every clock inside the ranch stopped simultaneously. 2:13 a.m. Cold spread through the house, sharp enough to burn my lungs. Outside, pale lights descended through the clouds, massive glowing shapes drifting silently toward the ranch fields. Blue-white light flooded the fences and rooftops. I tried to stay inside, but something pulled at me. Not physically, a feeling, a pressure deep inside my chest. The humming called softly through the darkness. Gentle, patient. I opened the front door slowly. Fog rolled across the porch. The air smelled electrical and burned. Beyond the fields, enormous lights hovered silently above the ranch, too bright to look at directly. Shapes moved within the glow, tall figures stepping carefully through the fog, long pale limbs unfolding beneath the light. The cattle stood motionless in the pasture, heads tilted upward. The sky above Black Hollow Ranch slowly opened. Clouds peeled apart in a massive circle, revealing endless pale brightness beyond. The humming became almost beautiful then, warm, comforting. I walked slowly into the yard, cold grass bending beneath my feet. The fog wrapped around my legs. All around the ranch, figures emerged silently from the mist, watching, waiting. Some looked human, some did not. Far above them, something enormous moved within the opening sky, ancient shapes drifting behind endless white light. The ranch house groaned softly behind me, windows vibrating, floorboards shaking. Then every pale light descended lower, closer. The figures surrounding the yard slowly raised their heads together, and for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ranch, I understood the humming. It was not a warning. It was a call. The fog parted slowly before me, the pale light flooding across the fields and fences. I looked upward as the sky opened completely overhead, and somewhere beyond that endless brightness, something vast finally looked back at me. Then the ranch disappeared into white silence.